Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm Ron Birnbaum. I live in Silver Lake. And in January, I was elected to represent the 51st Assembly District in the Democratic State Central Committee. And because of that, maybe you, like me, are trying to learn more about how the Democratic Party works. And I've learned some stuff about that, and that's what I want to share with you today. But I want to talk about it in the context of progressive politics. When I think about progressive politics, I sort of think of it as standing on two legs. So one leg is a set of identifiable policies that put human needs first, and like here, and for example, single-payer healthcare would be a good example of that. A second part of that policy's leg is that the policies are inclusive, that they don't leave people out. So we can identify these policies, but there's more to it than that. Because we think that power and policies should come from people and should be for people, then it matters the way they come about. And that's what I call the progressive method. And there's some common kind of characteristics of progressive method, that it involves grassroots organizing, that it is a bottom-up process, not top-down, that it's coalitional, it's about groups that come together and help each other. It definitely involves organizing itself. I mean, I always say that when the clipboards come out, you know you're winning the battle. And it should speak to the human spirit, too. That's a special part of progressive method.
I like your charts.
Now, thank you. So there's definitely some stuff that is sort of like what it's not about, right? And so what it's not about is insiderism and cronyism. It's not bought by big money.
And there's a lot of that now.
There is way too much of that, no question. And something else you see is sort of horse trading of power. That's not progressive stuff. And then sometimes rules that box people out of the political process.
And you'll show us that today?
Yeah, I'm going to show you kind of how some of the structures that are in place in the Democratic Party maybe need to be reformed to reflect these priorities more. But that begins with understanding what's there. Because if you take human beings, people, and you give them knowledge of how things work, that combination is unstoppable. So people talk about the Democratic Party like it's one thing, but it's actually 3 levels of organizations. There's a county party, a state party, and a national party. So the county party focuses primarily on local politics and elections. And an example would be the Los Angeles County Democratic Party. It has an elected central committee that runs it, and then it has a chairman, and right now that chairman's name is Eric Bauman. So then there's a state party, and the state party likewise has an elected, and we'll see also appointed, state central committee and an executive board in California. And right now there's a chairman of the party whose name is John Burton. Finally, there's the national party, which may be the most familiar to people who know the least about this. So the National Democratic Party is run by the DNC, or Democratic National Committee, and there's a chair of that, and that chairman is Tom Perez. So there's 3 sort of tiers to the Democratic Party, and we're going to focus, because that's what I'm part of, with the state Democratic Party.
Okay, great.
The party is mostly run by a big committee, which is called the Democratic State Central Committee. And here's where you start to see that what seems like it should be a very purely lowercase d democratic sort of body, it's not quite what you might think it would be. So let's get into that. So it turns out the DSCC, or the Democratic State Central Committee, is about 3,200 people, so it's big. And there's actually 3 different ways you can get onto the Democratic State Central Committee. So the first is that a third of those numbers are elected directly by people in...
We elect them.
Like, yeah, just like regular Democrats have to be a member of the party for at least the day of the election. And they're elected every 2 years at a caucus-style election, which is called an ADEM, an Assembly District Election Meeting. And it's what it sounds like. They're done in each Assembly District, and they all happen on one weekend all over the state of California at once. So some are on Saturday, some are on Sunday, and that's where a third of the delegates come from. And so that's like the most grassroots part of the DSCC.
A lot of people don't know about that process.
Yeah, no, I learned about it relatively recently myself. So now the next third of the people are elected by the county central committee. So remember before I was telling you that there's county, state, and national. So the county party, the central committee of that is elected at the ballot box. And then those committee members every 2 years elect representatives to the Democratic State Central Committee, and that's another roughly 1/3 of the DSCC.
Okay.
And then here's where it gets sort of the least grassroots. It turns out that
Those
there
are grass.
yeah. So right.
grassroots.
So there's like long grass, middle-sized grass, and dirt.
All right.
So in the dirt part, there are people who are elected officials, like assembly people and state senators, etc. They themselves, by virtue of being elected and being a Democrat, get to be on the committee, and they get to appoint people to the committee. So a typical assembly person might appoint 6 delegates to the party central committee, and the people who are in charge, like the speaker of the assembly, or the president pro tem, or the chair of the congressional delegation from California, they appoint 30 people. So you start to see that not everybody on the central committee sort of came directly from grassroots processes. And then you may ask, well, who says that this is the way it is? Well, the party is governed by a set of bylaws, a set of rules that are ultimately voted on by these people, and that's where these rules come from.
This looks fun. What's going on?
All right, so I know this is like a crazy picture with lots of boxes and stuff in it, but let me try to explain it.
Okay.
So sort of homing in on how the party in California works. And one thing about looking at this poster is understanding that I've put in red, like I've made a red box around the places that I think are kind of the roadblocks for progressive politics.
Oh, so the red are roadblocks.
Red is for a
Oh,
roadblock.
right.
So like a little bit before, I was saying that at the main sort of body that runs the party is the Democratic State Central Committee. That's like 3,000 plus people, and that it's some of them are elected directly, and some are sent by the county, and some are pleos, which are elected officials and their appointees. Now, once a year, this group of people gathers and elects a chair to the party. Now, there's also, I should mention at this point, the executive board, which is a smaller group of people that does something kind of similar to the Democratic State Central Committee, but they meet like 4 times a year and kind of conduct business between the conventions. So that's a smaller group of people. Similarly, in each assembly district, so 80, there's a directly elected member of the executive board, but then there's all these other ways that people can get on the executive board, which I will call less grassroots than being elected at that ADEM election.
This is the e-board.
This is also called the e-board frequently, that's right. So, but the chair is elected by the big group of people, the 3,000, at the party convention, and that happens every 4 years in like the odd year after a presidential election. And like I said, currently the chair is John Burton, although in May we're going to be having an election to vote for a new chair. Now, part of the secret of how this all works is that the chair has a ton of power. So the chair, of course, hires the staff that does all the daily work of the party, but the chair also has this incredible power of appointing every chair, vice chair, and every member, every single member of every standing committee. And these standing committees are things like the Credentials and Legislation Committee and Platform Committee and Resolution Committee. But very importantly, they appoint every member of the Rules Committee. So if you start to feel like some of the rules box out kind of the grassroots voice in the party, well, everybody on that committee, which is sort of a choke point where new rules have to get approved, is appointed directly by the chair.
So, okay, there's many committees.
There's many committees,
Credentials,
right?
legislation, for example, platform,
Yeah.
these are all examples.
Mm-hmm.
And so he appoints every chair, vice chair, and member.
And every single member. Nobody's elected.
Nobody's
Nobody's
He
elected to
appoints
any
the
of these committees.
whole
Every
committee?
single one is an appointee of the chair.
That's insane.
And serves at the pleasure of the chair. Yeah, it is insane. And you can start to see that there's incredible power in the chair.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, the chair appoints all these people who do the rules. And then if you start to feel like some of these rules favor insiders, right? Because there's a lot of like appointments to these bodies. Well, that's where it comes from. You start to see how this works to kind of perpetuate itself as being a little bit of an inside baseball type game and not completely responsive to the grassroots.
Not democratic.
Yeah, not democratic with a lowercase d.
Okay. And I see caucuses or something over there.
Yeah. So the caucuses, now this is interesting. So caucuses, anybody who's a Democrat in the state can join a caucus. And the caucuses are sort of arranged by interest groups, and there's more than I showed here. But for example, the Chicano Latino Caucus, the Children's Caucus, the Labor Caucus, and they obviously focus on those issues that are specific to their area of interest, and they can propose resolutions. And it's also the case that they do vote for their own officers, and the chair of each caucus gets a seat on the executive board. So there's a little bit of power there. That's a little bit more lowercase d democratic. And so that's the caucuses. Now there's also other officers, of 2 vice chairs and a secretary and a comptroller, but they have way less power than the chair.
All right. And the influence of the e-board on the DSCC, would that be?
Well,
the right
no,
phrasing?
so it's more like the e-board, essentially the DSCC is such a big group of people that it can only get together and vote on stuff once a year at the convention. But the executive board or the e-board gets together 4 times a year. It's a smaller group, it's 300 people. And between the conventions, essentially has the power to do most of the stuff that the DSCC can do. It doesn't elect officers, it doesn't pass the platform, but many of the other functions of the party are kind of ongoing in the e-board. And actually it's worth mentioning too, that it's the e-board that votes on and appoints members to the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. So there is a source of kind of power at that level from the executive board.
Okay.
So you start to see how this sort of, how it's a system that perpetuates its own power sort of for insiders, right? And maybe you start to see why it's really important who we elect as the chair, whether they see rules as needing to serve kind of inside type politics, or should the rules really be serving the power of the grassroots member of the Democratic Party?
What do we got here?
All right, so why is this important to a person who is a Democrat and wants to be active and wants to be involved, and why do they need to know all this stuff? Like, is it important? Well, I think it is, the way to figure out why it's important is to understand, well, what can like the Democratic State Central Committee do? And so when I think about how it works, I sort of think of 3 main things that it does. But the first thing that these delegates need to do, if they're doing their job, is to get input and listen to you, right? Like, they should be people who you can talk to, who are accessible to you, and you to say, this is what's important to me, and this is what matters, and I don't like how that worked, and I don't like where this thing went, and I want more of this, and they should be people who you can find and then communicate with. So, so I'm giving here just the example of our district, but it's the 51st.
You're in the 51st.
We're in the 51st, but it applies to everybody. And so I think that there are three main things these delegates do. So one is that every year there's this convention where everybody gets together. And a set of events that aren't the same every year happen at this convention. So as I mentioned,
That are the same.
it's not the same
not
every
the
year.
same.
Yeah, so for example, the election of the officers happens every 4 years, which is in the odd year after a presidential election.
Okay.
And then in odd years, too, there are resolutions that are passed. So the resolutions are kind of statements or a sense of the party of values on a specific issue without direct specific reference to specific pieces of legislation.
For example, like a caucus, one of the caucuses you
Could propose, like for example, the Children's Caucus could propose a resolution that says the state really should fund universal pre-K for all children. That would be an example of a resolution, without it speaking specifically about a bill for that purpose. So now, in even years, there is enactment of a platform. So it's a whole set of, it's kind of like a big resolution of a whole set of values that takes into account resolutions that were passed since the last time. And then every year, there is the DSCC at the convention can vote on rule changes to the bylaws. So those are the things that happen at the convention.
That's all the time.
That happens every year. But remember that chair election that's coming up is super important because so much power flows out of the chair's
They appointed
position.
all these people.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, there's two other things that I think that these delegates can do and that you can be sort of feeding into.
You meaning me, someone like me who is not a delegate, like
who's a Democrat, who is just a registered Democrat and cares about what's going on.
So for those of you who dem entered,
Right. If you dem exited,
and you want to see what it's about.
Although actually, anybody can talk to these folks. So the next important thing is that the members of the committee endorse candidates for state offices
is that
or
candidates?
national offices. What's that?
Is that candidates right there?
Yeah, that's the word candidates. My handwriting is terrible. It's doctor stuff. So.
I'm sorry.
No.
The DSCC.
Yeah, so the delegates endorse candidates for statewide offices, for Congress, for the Assembly, State Senate. What they don't do is the president, and then they don't do local and city and county.
And this is
type
delegates
elections.
Collectively, because right now we have 51st delegates, but this is
Right.
collectively.
Well, for example, for a
statewide.
statewide office like Attorney General, everybody would vote on the endorsement for that. For a district-specific office, for example, right now we're having an election in the 34th district, a special election for Congress. Then only the people who are delegates but reside in that district, vote on that election. On that endorsement process. And for special elections, it's just called a special election endorsing caucus. And for the regular elections, it's a multi-step process that begins with what's called a pre-endorsement conference. And then at the convention, there's actually the endorsement process.
So the endorsement of there's an endorsement of a candidate in 34 right now?
Yeah, the endorsed candidate is Jimmy Gomez.
And he was endorsed because...
He was endorsed by a group of people who were DSCC delegates who were seated at that time. So we're not the newly elected ones aren't seated till the convention.
Okay.
So the people who were seated at that time who resided within your registered voting address has to be within that district. So in this case, the 34th district. And that happened in early February.
How much weight do the delegates have in the endorsement process?
It's 100% a vote by those delegates. And there has to be kind of a quorum that show up, and there's a threshold that has to be met for the endorsement. It's for the special elections, I think it's 60%.
And how much
check that.
influence do the people have over the decision the delegates make when they endorse?
Not enough, in my opinion. So one thing we found with this last endorsing conference, that we didn't even hear about when it was happening till the result was reported in the news. And so we didn't know that it was happening to be able to give input to the people who are voting in it. So I would consider that another sort of problem of insiderism in the party. And there were probably some other problems with that endorsing caucus. So that's a place we should be looking at the rules and processes for that. So now they also look, when there's a ballot initiative, it's kind of like voting. They do endorsement for or against, or they can do no endorsement for a ballot initiative as well. And so the last thing is just what I call intangible stuff. And so that just sort of, because you've been elected to this thing, it's sort of a little marker that you care and you're active and that you know some people and that you're involved. And then people can use that sort of feather in their cap in different ways. So they maybe if you write a letter to the editor, you can put it in the, at the bottom. If you are going to speak at a town hall, you can drop that you're, that you're involved in that. Yeah, and that maybe, who knows, that therefore people will listen to you a little bit more.
Yeah, influence.
Yeah, and so, that's sort of up to the individual how they sort of use it as a, it might make it so that you're more likely to, if you call up an elected person's office, that somebody gets you right to the, to the member. Maybe, who knows? That hasn't exactly been. What's that? Yeah, maybe. I haven't found that like doors are opening wide just because Ron Birnbaum was, elected to that. But at least I have been at like a town hall where I've mentioned it and that kind of thing. So the key is that these delegates, they do this stuff at the convention. They're important for the endorsement of candidates and ballot initiatives. And remind you that, like, before elections, you often get like a mailer, right, that says who the Democratic Party endorsed. What's that?
Oh, right.
No, and that's where that information came from. And it turns out that actually there's a pretty good study that was done of the endorsing process by like political scientists in California, and it does actually matter. It makes a difference in elections. It gives people sometimes like 7 to 15 percentage points, which can turn an election. So it's not irrelevant. And it is a place where you can try to influence people by you, as in you, the Democrat, the grassroots can influence the people who are elected to try to do that, pick people who share your values and care about the things you care about.
We can apply pressure. Delegates do care what the people who voted for them think.
Right, and like, for example, absolutely. And so same thing for the stuff from the convention. So you could say, well, I share the values of this candidate for chair, and why don't, so would you please vote for that, candidate for chair? People should listen to you. So, so that's I think kind of the big picture is that you have this party, it has a little bit of a complicated structure. It is understandable. It's not hopelessly complex, but when you start to dig into it and start to understand, you also see some things that make you understand how power gets perpetuated within the party structure that isn't 100% responsive to just people and what they need. So we've got some work to do still on the Democratic Party. That's one of the reasons I and other people ran for this, so we could do that work.